Fellow Rotarians, distinguished guests, today I have the privilege and honour to introduce Professor the Honourable Gareth Evans, ACQC. Professor Evans is well known as Australia's Foreign Minister from 1988 to 1996 during the Hawke and Keating governments. Rather than chronicle Professor Evans' notable and distinguished careers, which will take most of the time of our speaker, I thought to touch on several areas of his impact and influence you may not be aware of. During his 21-year political career, he was a Cabinet Minister for 13 of those years, including holding the portfolios of Attorney General, Resources and Energy, Transport and Communications, and Foreign Affairs and Trade. He maintained a comprehensive agenda for law and constitutional reform, including the establishment of the Aboriginal Legal Service nationally, the Commonwealth Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, and the National Crime Authority. He has championed the establishment of a Bill of Rights since 1972, an issue we still debate nearly 50 years on. He shaped the reform of family, business, and freedom of information laws and the deregulation of the airline industry. He guided the Native Title Bill through the Senate, the longest Senate debate on a single bill. He continues to support voluntary assisted dying legislation. Internationally, Professor Evans laid the groundwork for the establishment of the ASEAN Regional Forum, enhancing peace and security in the Pacific, established the APEC Forum, and signed the Timor Gap Treaty, facilitating exploration and exploitation of oil and gas reserves in the Timor Sea. Most notably, Professor Evans played a significant role in brokering the settlement of conflict in Cambodia and the establishment of a UN Transitional Authority to run the country through transition, for which he was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. His extremely active post-parliamentary career has focused on arms control and international conflict resolution, where he has chaired, led and participated in many notable international organisations, reducing conflict and promoting peace globally. There is much alignment with Professor Evans' work and our club and Rotary's efforts in peace building. He is also a member of the International Advisory Board of the Institute of Economics and Peace, who are supporting our Positive Peace Workshop in July. Our past President Heidi Unfordorben and I are IEP Peace Ambassadors. And amongst all the die-hard Crows and Port supporters in the room, Professor Evans and I are probably the only two lifelong Hawthorn supporters. Professor Evans has written or edited more than 14 books, published many hundreds of chapters and articles on foreign relations, human rights, politics and legal reform. His latest book, Good International Citizenship, The Case for Decency, argues the case for Australia to be a good international citizen and the key benchmarks in assessing any country's record as a good international citizen. Would you please join me in warmly welcoming Professor the Honourable Gareth Evans, ACQC.
Well, thank you, Mark, for the very warm and generous introduction. Thank you to Heidi for the introduction, to Paul for the hospitality, and to all of you for the pleasure of talking to you today. I want to add my particular commiserations to Roy Scragg, who I had the pleasure of meeting for the first time just a few minutes ago. Roy, in that short conversation, told me that he featured quite prominently in one of the biographies of Bob Hawke, which reminded me of one of my favourite Bob Hawke stories, which is that in a book about another distinguished Australian, Garfield Barwick, written by David Marr, there's an index entry which deserves to be immortalised, namely, Hawke RJ, no mention of. For a deeply narcissistic personality, this is something very hard to cope with. Look, someone once said, and I think it was, in fact, Queen Victoria's favourite Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, that my idea of an agreeable person is someone I agree with. Well, taking that as my guide, and I would, wouldn't I, being a former politician, I have to say that you are an audience like any other Rotary Club, that I think I'm going to find very agreeable indeed. And I say that because the particular theme of my talk today, a case for decency in the conduct of international affairs, is one that I know resonates very closely with Rotary's core business. The promotion of high ethical standards and the ideal of service in all fields of endeavour, and through the application of those principles, the advancement, as we just heard a little while ago, international understanding, goodwill and peace. What I mean by Australia or any other country being a decent country, or what I like to call a good international citizen, is being the kind of country that others respect, trust and want to emulate. Not just one that's wholly inward-looking and wholly self-interested, self-absorbed. Being a country that genuinely cares about poverty, conflict, human rights atrocities, health epidemics, environmental catastrophes, weapons proliferation, other problems affecting, very often, people in places very far from our own shores. And being the kind of country that cares about these issues, even when doing so, may involve absolutely no direct benefit to us at all, and may indeed, on occasions, involve some actual cost. No direct benefit, that is, to our traditional core national interests of security and prosperity. Everyone, I think, gets it that the traditional core business of any country's foreign policy is how we protect and advance our national interests in two big ways: ensuring our physical security and our material prosperity. And of course, there's a lot to discuss about how we manage both these dimensions. For example, in Australia's case, how we should navigate our currently rather fraught relationship with China simultaneously with the United States. And I'm happy to respond to any questions you might have if we have time on any of those themes. But what I really want to talk about today is, and make the focus of my talk, is on the little book. It's a very little book. It's more really just an essay rather than a book, on this subject of good international citizenship, the case for decency. My argument is that there's a third dimension to any country's national interests, which should also be regarded as core business, and not just some kind of optional extra. And that is our national interest in being and being seen to be a good international citizen. It's a dimension of our foreign policy which I'm afraid has too often gone missing in recent years, but in my view is absolutely critical to both our sense of self-worth as a nation and to our international standing. This is an approach which gets more resistance than you might think. The response one often gets from political hardheads, and I can testify this from my own rather lengthy cabinet experience, is that this sort of stuff, good international citizenship, is really just Boy Scout stuff. Something nice to do from time to time if you've got the cash available or if there's some pressure group internally pushing you to do so. But not the real business of national government. My answer, which I hope will be seen as compelling, is that we have both a moral imperative and a national interest imperative to be and be seen to be a good international citizen. The starting point is the moral imperative. The case for good international citizenship is simply that this is the right thing to do. That states, like individuals, have a moral obligation to do the least harm and the most good they can. Of course, answers will vary depending on whether you come to these issues from a religious, spiritual perspective or a philosophical one as to precisely what the source of the relevant ethical obligations are. But the striking thing is, whatever ethical tradition you're talking about, religious, humanistic or otherwise, how much convergence there is around basic principles. We should think of different approaches to moral reasoning, as a British philosopher put it, as climbing the same mountain, really just from different sides. In their different ways, the different ethical traditions, both religious and secular, all really point in essentially the same direction, demanding at their core respect for our common humanity. And recognition of and respect for our common humanity is really the moral core of the concept of good international citizenship. When it comes to the second part, however, of my case for good international citizenship, is that the returns are more than just warm inner glow returns. Decent behaviour can generate really quite hard-headed, practical national advantage of the kind that appeals to realists and political cynics, as well as to the idealists among us. I think there are in fact three kinds of hard-headed return for a country being seen to be decent, being seen to be a good international citizen. The first return is reputational, and this is very important. A country's general image, how it projects itself, its culture, its values, its policies, how in turn it's seen by others, is a really quite fundamental importance in determining how well that country succeeds in advancing and protecting its traditional national interests. Over many decades of really very active international engagement, I've personally witnessed over and again how well this soft power, as it's been called, matters. It matters in determining whether one is seen as a good country to invest in, to trade with, a good country to visit, a good country to study in, a good country to trust in security terms, and it matters in being seen as a good country to support for responsible international positions and to work with in responsible international decision-making forums. The second return from good international citizenship, the second hard-headed return, is reciprocity. Foreign immune to ordinary human instincts than anyone else. And if I take your problem seriously in international affairs, be it piracy or terrorism or an environmental catastrophe, then you're that much more likely to take my problems in dealing with people or human trafficking or crime or whatever it is more seriously in turn. And the reciprocity involved is not always very explicit, not always transparent. Subtlety will often be an advantage in achieving it. But no practicing diplomat, no one who's been in my business, will be unaware of the reality of that reciprocity syndrome and the utility of this particular dynamic. No government policymaker should be oblivious to it. The third return is more simply getting things done that might otherwise be very hard to achieve, making progress on issues particularly where the whole world, including us, does ultimately benefit, like climate change, but where the cost, the national cost for many players along the way might seem for a long time to outweigh the benefits, and where the necessary collective international action is accordingly very hard to achieve. And the short point is this: the more states that have a cooperative, collective, good international citizenship mindset, the better the chance of these things getting done. My argument that good international citizenship is both a moral imperative and a national interest imperative, that it's possible to be simultaneously both idealistic and pragmatic, might be thought by some political leaders to be a bit too complicated, but on this as on many other subjects, I'm often reminded of the immortal line from the Scottish Labour leader of the 1930s, Jimmy Maxton, who famously once said, "If they can't ride two bloody horses, they shouldn't be in the bloody circus." And I think that's what you've got to do, be both idealistic and pragmatic in the way in which you approach these issues. Well, there are four big practical benchmarks that I see as mattering most, mattering above all else when one is assessing any country's record as a good international citizen. Being a generous aid donor, doing everything we can to protect and advance universally recognised human rights. Thirdly, doing everything we reasonably can to achieve international peace and security, to prevent the horror and the misery of war and mass atrocity crimes, and in that context to alleviate their consequences, including for refugees fleeing their impact. And finally, my fourth benchmark is being an actively committed participant in attempts to meet the great existential risks we all know the planet now faces, posed by health pandemics, by climate change, and by nuclear war. Australia likes to think of itself as a good international citizen, along with countries traditionally so regarded like Norway and Sweden and Canada. And from time to time, I think we've actually deserved to be so regarded, but only from time to time. Against these benchmarks, and I spend most of my little book, about 50 pages of its 80-something pages, spelling this out in detail, overall, I have to say, our record has been very patchy. It's been lamentable at its worst, and for the last few years, without wanting to be partisan about it in this audience, it's been embarrassingly poor. I'll be happy to give more chapter and verse on all these issues, again, if we have any time in questions. But in short, the story is this. When it comes to overseas aid, we've been the worst performed of any rich country donor in terms of the decline in our generosity over the last 5 decades. Under the Morrison government, we were spending only half as much in real equivalent terms as we spent during the Menzies years, for example. Our proportion of aid is now trending down below 0.2% of gross national income, whereas the international gold standard is 0.7, and there's many countries that achieve that. It's not a happy story. On human rights, what happens at home very much matters abroad. Nobody likes a hypocrite. And in that context, our record has been at best mixed. Sometimes ahead of the game internationally, for example, with apartheid, but sometimes lagging badly behind. I can give examples if you want to pursue that. So too with our contributions to international peace and security. Our response, I have to say, our strong bipartisan response to Russia's absolutely morally and legally indefensible invasion of Ukraine is really an example of good international citizenship, I think, at its best, because this is a context in which we don't stand to really gain in any way directly in security terms, nor in economic terms. What we might pick up in higher wheat and other food prices, we're certainly going to lose in higher energy prices. So it's not something we're doing for any of those traditional reasons. It's something we're doing and probably should be doing because it's the right thing to do. But in terms of peacemaking, diplomacy, responding to mass atrocity crimes, we've also played, I think it's fair to say, some important positive roles, I guess notably in Cambodia, as has been mentioned. On international peacekeeping, we've always done well, but we've accepted far too few such obligations in recent years. At last count, we had not thousands of peacekeepers in the field, not even hundreds. We had less than 50 spread across 4 missions in 4 continents in a world that's absolutely crying out for that kind of commitment. Australia's not supplying it. In the case of actual war fighting, we've been at our best when making our own decision to fight just wars that are legally as well as morally defensible. At our worst, as in Vietnam or Iraq in 2003, when persuaded to go to war for less than just causes in the hope of buying alliance insurance protection against possible future threats to ourselves. It's not a completely happy story. In meeting our responsibilities to refugees and asylum seekers, complex story, but I think a very sad one, in which, particularly since the race to the bottom, since the Tampa affair, you'll all unhappily remember, we have not covered ourselves in any glory at all. And neither side of politics has distinguished itself. I just hope the Labor Party will do a lot better. I'm not opposed to boat turnbacks, provided there's provisions in place to ensure that people are going to find safe haven somewhere. But whether we need offshore processing, mandatory, and all the rest of the horror story that's been associated with our treatment of refugees and asylum seekers in recent years, I think, is another question, and one which needs to be put very directly, as I will certainly be doing it, to the new government. As to helping the 3 great existential risks to life on this planet as we know it, our international performance here has really been pretty underwhelming. Maybe we can give ourselves a bare pass in the case of response to pandemics. Reasonably responsible in our international response, the Chinese inquiry brain fade notwithstanding, but doing much less than we can and should be doing, Papua New Guinea in particular, in our own region, and in financially supporting the global COVAX program, where we've been a real laggard. I don't need to spend any time at all on climate change, where I think we'd all acknowledge that's been a dismal failure, grudging, minimalist, and doing absolutely nothing to redeem our now very well-established international reputation as a climate laggard. A big issue during the election campaign. We are going to see some changes. They can only be for the good. On nuclear weapons, lots to say about this. We have played a useful role in the past, and I think we can again in the future, in advancing both the ultimate goal of nuclear weapons elimination, the most indiscriminately inhumane class of weapons ever devised, but also in the more limited but realistic immediate task of nuclear risk reduction. Our contribution in recent years has been anything but helpful in that respect, but again, I live in hope that there may be some change of approach. Finally, what I want to talk about is the politics of decency. What's intriguing is that in all the available evidence, as I describe in some detail in the last section of this little book, the problem lies not with the negative attitudes, the cynical attitudes of our people, but rather too often with cynical governments, both the politicians and the civil servants. Australian polling, however, conducted by the Lowy Institute over the last 15 years, shows really clear and overwhelming public support for just about all my benchmark tests of good international citizenship. Very strong public support when people are asked very directly, do you support an appropriate intervention in response to genocide and other mass atrocity crimes, and so on and so on. Aid at first sight seems to be a big exception. The Development Minister under the last government was very fond of quoting a Lowy Institute poll 4 years ago, I think, saying that nearly 80% of the Australian population thought we were spending too much on aid and certainly shouldn't be spending any more than we were. And on the face of it, that seems like a case of charity really beginning at home and not much enthusiasm for being a good international citizen. But when you drill down, as the Lowy Institute did the following year, to see what lay behind this, it was a very intriguing result. Whereas in the first year, a particular dollar figure had been given. We're spending $3.8 billion, I think it was, on aid. Is this too much or not enough or whatever? And you heard the result. What they did the following year was to approach the issue completely differently. The question was, how much do you think we are spending now on aid as a percentage of our national budget? And how much do you think we should be spending? When asked how much people thought we were actually spending, they said, on average, the answer was $14 in every 100, 14%. I said, that's too much, we can't afford that. When asked should be spending, they said $10, 10% in every 10%. The actual amount we were spending then was 80 cents, 0.8%. So you had people thinking we were spending, in responding as they did to the question, we're spending too much, you had people thinking we were spending 17.5 times as much as we actually were, but were prepared to spend 12.5 times as much as we actually were. So Australians are instinctively generous about this and other things, and I think this is a story that can be repeated right across the spectrum of decency issues that I've described. So the bottom line is that when governments, I think, have taken strongly principled, good international citizenship positions, they've had no obvious difficulty in taking the community with them. The nervousness that so many of them have shown has not had any obvious political justification. Maybe these issues are not generally sufficiently central and salient to win elections, although I think we would all acknowledge that the climate issue was very central and very salient in the election just concluded. Maybe, but there's no evidence of which I'm aware at all that any of these issues are actual election users. So my position is this: a country with Australia's general record and reputation as an energetic, creative middle power, which has many times in the past played a world-leading role in international diplomacy, we should be setting our sights higher. The bottom line, again, is that we have just one planet, we're a global community, and our political leaders should give more weight than many of them have done to what Abraham Lincoln once famously described as the better angels of our nature. I do have confidence, as you would expect me to, that the new Labor government, not least with Adelaide's own wonderful Penny Wong as Foreign Minister, gets it about the case for decency and will act accordingly, significantly restoring and advancing our national reputation in the process. But she and the government will be strongly helped in that enterprise if there is visible community support for the decency agenda that I have described. And in generating that support, I know that the Rotary community will be, as it has been so often in the past, a very important player. When it comes to the necessity for decency in the conduct of personal, business, national and international affairs, Rotary gets it, and long may you continue to do so. Thank you.
Professor Evans, you describe yourself as an incorrigible optimist.
I did.
Your career so far has led and inspired change for a better world, both in politics and international affairs. Such efforts are never easy. How has your optimism supported your drive to succeed?
Basically because I just don't think you get out of bed in the morning unless you believe that you can actually get something done to implement the principles and the policies for which you've long stood. Optimism is self-reinforcing in exactly the same way that pessimism is self-defeating. And if we do want change, as most of us do, particularly when we're talking about the kind of issues I'm talking about today, you can't just assume that change will somehow happen. You've got to work for it. And in working for anything, you've got to believe that the effort has a chance of being rewarded. The last few years internationally, it's not been congenial for optimists. The world is a messier place, a more troubling place, a more fragile place, a more volatile place than it's been for a long time. Very different from the world that I inhabited as Foreign Minister in the late 80s, early 90s. In fact, channeling William Wordsworth, I wrote in one of my books, bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, and to be Foreign Minister was the very heaven. Because you had an environment in which the ice floes had broken, there was cooperation among the major players on the Security Council and elsewhere. Things seemed achievable, like Cambodian peace settlements and so on, that had previously been completely stuck. Things seemed achievable, like the Chemical Weapons Convention, which had been stuck for 20 years. And we did achieve those things. It's harder now. It's harder, much harder to keep your optimism. But keep it you must, because if you don't, there's no chance at all of the world being a safer, saner, more civilised, just and decent place.
I'm wondering why Australia invited Polynesians to come and pick fruit, but didn't invite Melanesians.
A very good question, and I think one of the ways in which we can recapture our credibility, our standing, our reputation in the Pacific Islands as being far more generous across the board with work visas. I guess the neurosis was there's 6 million or more Papua New Guineans and there's rather fewer Polynesians scattered around and maybe we're going to be swamped. But there are ways of handling that with quotas and so on that can, in fact, keep things reasonably orderly. But this is an area where we can afford to be very generous and very decent indeed. And even though we've flagged some very important changes in our approach to the Pacific, with big packages of aid money and, of course, a fundamental change in our approach to climate, which is an existential issue for so many Pacific Island countries, I think the reality is we're going to have to be a lot more generous as well when it comes to these worker issues. And you absolutely cannot distinguish between Melanesia, Polynesia, Micronesia. You've got to be generous across the board. The demand is there. The need for those workers in Australia is manifestly there. People are crying out for it. And we can afford to be a lot more generous than we have been. So, good question, Roy.
Hello, sir. I have a question regarding the relation between Australia and the NATO in general. Do you think in recent years the relation between, I'd say, US and Australia has deteriorated? And is there a need for Australia to become an official member of NATO? Would it help?
I think we've got enough complications without getting drawn into Euro-Atlantic issues of that kind. I mean, we've obviously got good professional and defence liaison relationships with many NATO countries, including the two of the most significant of them, the United States and the United Kingdom, with the AUKUS arrangement, which does take us a little bit back in the direction of the Anglosphere and back in that NATO sort of direction. But I don't think we either need to or should go down that particular path. The critical need for us in our own region, and let's face it, our future is going to be determined by our geography, not by our history. The critical need is to develop very, very strong relationships with the key Asian countries in our own region. We've neglected too many of those relationships. I'm absolutely delighted to see that Albanese's first trip, apart from the flying visit to Tokyo for the Quad meeting, his first trip is going to be to Indonesia in a few days' time. And that's absolutely as it should be. We've neglected that relationship. We need to work harder on our relationship with the other really big players in the region, not only Japan and India, which we all know about, but South Korea, very, very important. Vietnam, I mean, Morrison, to give him his due, he wasn't very flash on most foreign policy issues in my judgment, but he did get it about the need to develop a working relationship with Vietnam as one of the countries he did visit. And it's very, very important. Not so much ASEAN as such. ASEAN as a collective is in real strife at the moment. I mean, Cambodia and Laos are sort of paid up subsidiaries, wholly owned subsidiaries of China. Philippines, Thailand, Myanmar, obviously, all got very serious problems with authoritarian governments, retreat from democracy, retreat from any kind of collective capacity. The future is going to lie with these individual relationships, but they're very, very important to cultivate. And I think far more than lusting after involvement in yet another group of military big guys, we ought to be focusing very, very hard on developing confident working relationships with the key players in our own region.
Thank you. Good to see you, incorrigible optimist again. I always, joke with my friends that you are the best prime minister we never had. But anyway, my question is regarding China. And do you think that because China being both import and export wise, our biggest trading partner, the way the new government is going, a bit harsh, or this tussle, is it a bit too much, or should you soften? And another question is, you talked about the humanitarian. Oh, it's just I think
that's enough to see us for another hour. But look, very briefly, our relationship with China. I mean, if I can channel that Scottish Labour guy, Jimmy Maxton, again, we've got to ride two bloody horses at once. And that is the horse of standing up to China when it overreaches, as it manifestly has in the South China Sea, as it manifestly has internally with its treatment of the Xinjiang Uyghurs, Hong Kong, Tibet. We all know the issues that demand to be stood up and called out and pushed back against. But at the same time, we have to get along with China. More than a third of our exports, hugely financially dependent. Other countries in the region are managing this balance better than we have. And we've got to recognise that part of the problem has been of our own making. Our rhetoric since 2017 has been absurdly overstrident and calculated to really cause quite deliberate offence, just being totally insensitive. I get it why people have felt rage periodically of the things that China has done, but in diplomacy it always makes sense not to up the ante too far. We've done things with nobody ever likes to talk about it, even in the Financial Review. We've done things with our anti-dumping exercise that we've initiated, which have frankly been without any economic justification at all and have really got up the Chinese nose. So at the moment we're facing a situation where China's got a whole poultice of sanctions on about 25-30% of our exports. We've succeeded reasonably in diversifying some of those, but it's a problem for us. And unless China puts a little bit on the table in terms of a willingness to step back from that, I don't think we should be rushing to embrace. Similarly, we've got a couple of Australian citizens being held in very murky circumstances. And again, you can't just reset the relationship in a way that ignores those constraints. But what's required is some deft diplomacy. And diplomacy's just gone out the window. Foreign Affairs and Trade Department's been completely marginalised over the last few years. Our foreign policy has been completely securitised. It's run by Defence Departments, run by the intelligence agencies, run out of the Prime Minister's office. A core of diplomats of real skill and capacity to navigate the people I worked with and had huge amount of confidence in. It's been hollowed out, and we've just got to rediscover the need for diplomacy. So I think it's going to take some time, but obviously the Chinese have recognised that all their wolf warrior stuff has backfired. We're not going to see much of a change on their side until after the big Congress meeting, which is going to guarantee, he presumes, Xi's longevity a bit longer. But, December this year is the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the Australia-China rapprochement, and I think that's a very important occasion to be working towards through multiple back channels. And Albanese's initial response was, maintaining a continuity of approach and not giving anything away, and that's not an unreasonable approach to adopt with China, because Chinese respect strength, they don't respect weakness. So, we had to make it clear that we weren't going to be patsies. But we've got to make it clear to the United States we're not going to be patsies with them either. And I could give you many stories about the way in which our policy benefited from actually making clear we had differences with the United States from time to time, rather than just being constantly the acolyte with four paws and waving and pink tummy exposed and tongue lolling. I mean, this is not where you want to be in your relationship with either the United States or China. It's a navigation exercise. We need to do it with a lot more sophistication and skill, but we can, and our future depends on getting it right.
Professor Evans, your presentation today gives us food for thought in how Australia can be a better international citizen. Perhaps it's fitting to conclude the discussion with the motto of the Hawthorn Football Club. Spectima agendo. Let us be judged by our acts.
Yeah.
I'd like to present you with a certificate of acknowledgement and a token of your generosity in joining us today. All monies raised today go directly to Rotary community and youth projects. Your presentation makes this possible. Rotarians and guests, would you please join me in thanking Professor the Honourable Gareth Evans.